This is the Blade 2 titanium backpacking stove by Fire Maple. So the backstory to this stove is that my friend Tyler, good friend of mine who actually runs the Canadian ultralight community on Facebook, his good friend Vince tested out this stove at -20 and he found that it failed on him. I asked him if I could borrow it just to test it out. It coincides really well with me having tested out the Fire Maple FMS F5 liquid stove, which if you haven't seen that video was a pretty big disaster. This stove is a remote canister stove, and I think it's attractive to a lot of people because it's really lightweight, it's a simple canister stove, and it appears to have a heating or a generator tube to allow the stove to be run upside down in liquid fuel mode. Very similar to one of my all-time favorites, the MSR WindPro 2. So it's not really cold enough to make the stove fail in terms of just not working in upright mode, but I'm just curious, if there's anything I can see about the stove, and also just having heard from Vince that it didn't work well when you flip the can upside down. So, before I get into kind of a side-by-side test, I figured I'd just walk you through what I've observed about it and looking at it in general. I think this stove looks a lot better than the FMS F5 liquid fuel stove. The build just looks better to me. Is it something I would rely on going out in the winter and really needing in cold weather? I'll get into that later. But overall, I think it's got a nice little design to it. It's got folding legs, so it folds down really compact. So on my scale, as it is 138 grams, just under 5 ounces for a remote canister stove. Comparing that to the WindPro 2, that's 204 grams with the inverted canister stand. So the canister stand I think is about half an ounce, so 15 grams. So call it 190 grams versus 140, so you're saving 50 grams with the Blade 2 and some money. So it's definitely a cheaper stove. I noticed that on the website it says that it has a fuel heating tube that gives it more consistent burning. It didn't say that you should be able to run it upside down, which are two pretty different things. So it does have a pretty nice output just as it is right now. And typically, even with the MSR WindPro, you have to give it about 20 seconds to warm up that generator tube. And then if you flip the can upside down, in my hands, it isn't really doing anything different right now. So it actually is sputtering a bit when I flip the can. I'm just curious if that's consistent. Doesn't seem to make a huge difference if you flip it. So remember, I'm guessing it's right around 0 right now. So fuel temperature shouldn't be an issue. But it is definitely pulsating when you flip that can upside down. And I can feel something happening in the can too. I'm not a huge fan of that. If we go back to upright, levels out. That's a pretty big difference right off the bat. I'm not sure what's happening there in terms of the dynamics of the stove. I think that was pretty obvious that there was a sputtering effect when you turn the can upside down. I'll just compare that to the WindPro. I've used this stove for years. So once it's warmed up, I just flip the can over and we'll see what happens. Give it a couple of minutes. I just want to point out that this stove is designed to be run inverted. It's designed to work both ways. So, if you look on the MSR website, they say that the stove is designed to run inverted, sort of for maximum output and performance in cold weather, or upright to have the most control over the flame. But this is my experience, generally speaking, that it runs very well with the can inverted. There's absolutely no issue, and it runs well down to very low temperatures. So, I mean, within that amount of time, the fire maple was kind of sputtering with the can inverted. So that's just telling me that it's not really a stove that's designed to be inverted. Something I do want to point out, that the MSR stove does have that canister little tripod, and it puts it at a slight angle. I'm just going to assume that the MSR engineers know what they're doing, and for some reason figured out that that's important. So you don't have that with the fire maple stove. Whether you need that angle or not, it's definitely nice when you're in the snow to have the can off the ground and not to have the valve sitting in snow. It keeps it off the ground a bit. It's kind of a nice feature. I'll do a quick boil test just to see in terms of time how long it takes to get a boil. All right, so that's 9:45 to get the boil. That was 16 grams of fuel to boil a liter of water. Now, it's just really hard to compare anything right now because I'm not doing a side-by-side. I don't think it's really the point of this. It's right around zero. The water was pretty cold, so boil times obviously are affected by the temperature, the starting temperature of your water. And generally speaking, I find, in a pretty controlled environment or similar environment, stoves tend to use about the same amount of fuel. But overall, what I really wanted to see was a major difference between these two stoves. So the MSR WindPro versus the fire maple blade. The MSR stove is designed to run inverted. It does so very well. I don't think the fire blade is designed to run inverted, and I don't think they really advertise it. They say that there's a warming tube to make the stove run without sputtering, but no comment about it being inverted. When I did invert it, it definitely does sputter. So I just want to show that again because I think it's pretty obvious. So it runs really smooth, upright, no question there. When you invert it, okay, here we go. So the sputtering's kicked in. You guys obviously saw that when I was running the can upright for 10 minutes, this didn't happen. I invert it and it goes back. It really runs quite well with the can upright. It's a little bit misleading in terms of just looking at it and saying, okay, there's a generator tube, therefore it must work with the can inverted. It just doesn't seem like it. Overall impressions. So it is a nice light little stove. For hard use, I would say it's very difficult to compare the two stoves. So the MSR stove, each leg and pot support assembly is a solid piece of steel. It's a really solid stove. So MSR stoves are well built. There's no question. I have no issue, putting a lot of weight on this, and I abuse my stoves when I'm out in the winter. This is more of an ultralight stove. There's a little tab right here, just a little bump that's sticking out at the hinge, the stopper that holds the leg when it's fully extended. It's just riveted there. So I would be concerned about applying a lot of weight on this or abusing the stove in general. I don't think you're gonna have any issues with it in light use, but in terms of heavy use, it just takes a bit of bending and then gets a bit loose or something like that. The little stopper might slide by. This is right under 5 ounces, and this stove is right over 7 ounces. So you're saving 2 ounces on the fire maple stove. You can't really compare these two. You're relying on this when you're out in the cold. Would I rely on the fire maple stove for winter camping? No, I wouldn't. If you want a remote canister stove for the summer, I think this could be a good little option. I don't have any concerns with it. I don't have any safety issues with it like I did with the FMS F5, which was scary, flat out scary. Comparing these two stoves, not really fair. Obviously, a lot cheaper to get the fire maple stove. In terms of long-term durability and use in hard conditions, the MSR stove is the way to go, in my mind.